Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, Director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Very happy to be joined again by Josh Blank, Research Director of the same Texas Politics Project. How are we this morning, Josh?
Wonderful.
Ready to talk.
Very much so.
Now, a lot of the time that we've spent here in the coverage of elections in Texas is now focused on the day-to-day of the election races, I think. And
blow-by-blow accounting.
Yeah, I mean, and which is understandable. We expect that from the cycle, and there are a lot of storylines in this race from, to be explored that we're seeing at the kind of blow-by-blow. But that said, I thought it might be a good idea to step back a little bit and to some degree circle back to attitudes about elections and voting. We've talked about this before quite a bit, but even though we haven't been hearing a whole lot about the subject, while news coverage has been in this kind of horse race, blow by blow, where can I dig out a story kind of campaign mode, I think we have every expectation we have every reason to expect that this subject is going to arise again, and it's going to arise again soon.
Yeah.
It is interesting to some degree. Discussion of voting rules hasn't been very prominent in the campaign. It's not much on voters' radar per our recent polling. I think only about 6% cited it as the factor most important to their vote. Mm-hmm. Democrats more likely to do that than Republicans, but not in a way that is dominant or predominates the agenda given what else is out there.
Well, it's one of those things I think we'll get to a little bit further in this discussion, but obviously when we're talking about voting and the elections and the issues around those things, Republicans and Democrats can both feel like those are issues, but they can be talking about different sets of issues, different concerns.
Right. And there are other things going on that are also pushing that out a little bit, right? So, while election issues might not be taking up a lot of real estate in voters' minds right now, I would expect that at the very least we'll begin to see an uptick in stories about voting in the Texas political press as we get closer to the beginning of in-person early voting. Now there's mail-in voting already going on for a pretty small slice of the electorate.
Right.
But early voting's getting pretty close. October 24th, as we record this, less than 2 weeks away. Mm-hmm. And again, I don't want to say like the issue is gone. There's been complete silence about it, especially nationally and especially in places where, there are election officials like secretaries of state that are elected and they're on the ballot this time. And among those candidates, there are in some prominent battleground states, there are, essentially election deniers and, unabashed advocates of more partisan administration of elections on the ballot in these states. Now, it looks a little differently here. Now, not completely differently because we've seen things going on at the local level on the podcast several weeks ago. We talked about things going on in Fredericksburg, a couple other areas of the state. And of course, Beto O'Rourke has incorporated voting into his campaign platform. So it's, we don't want to imply that there's a absolute silence out here and not that we're trying to get in front of a non-response we might be expecting or I might be expecting. But it hasn't been especially central since the rise in salience of abortion, gun violence, and it was never going to be particularly central to the Abbott campaign. So nonetheless, all that caveating and all the, all that sort of weaving and bobbing going, notwithstanding, I think both of us probably think it's not far below the surface. And especially in light of widely covered and discussed Democratic efforts in 2021 which were unsuccessful to thwart the Republicans' main voting bill, SB 1, during the last legislative session, including their exodus to Washington, D.C. And that I left a lot of scars in the chamber and lingering bad feeling. I think, that came up. You and I were both at Speaker Phelan's interview with Evan Smith,
Right.
which has come up a couple of times at the
Right.
Texas Tribune Festival. And Evan Smith asked the speaker about this, and he did say basically, yeah, there's some bad feeling out there, and the members kind of got to get over it a little bit.
Well, I mean, he almost
You know.
kind of said, "Hey, look, that's the Democrats' problem a little
Right.
bit." And basically, hey, I mean, whether you believe it or not, he says, look, you come to me with a clean slate, but you got to work. Your colleagues are your
I'm
colleagues.
unusually magnanimous, the speaker said.
Basically, he said, I mean, more or less.
He didn't say that, to be fair.
No, but more or less was, hey, you got a clean slate with me, but you got to convince everybody else.
Right. And look, there was some ill will that came out of that, which
Right.
is, to be expected. And again, for the way the Democrats left and then the Republican response, there were a lot of, hot feelings around
Just to
it.
say, look, if you've been following, let's say politics and the politics of voting and election rules for a while here, it's not unreasonable to think that this would have been a big mobilizing issue for Democrats, especially when you look at the role that, let's say, voter ID had in mobilizing Democrats around sort of,
Right.
2008, 2012, really sort of, becoming a mobilizing issue, especially in, diverse, usually largely African-American
Right.
states or states with large African-American populations. You saw this was a tool used a lot. We're not, again, it didn't feel like the same emphasis as maybe we've seen in the past on
in this moment. Yeah,
this moment.
Right. I think that's right. And again, it's pretty crowded out there, as we've had occasion to say. So
just observing, not criticizing.
Yeah. So let's So let's go back. And unpack this a little bit. I think just for context. So we've talked from time to time about the arc of the politics around voting and elections on the podcast and various things we've done. Mm-hmm. And you just raised, the voter ID debate. And, I think that while the heat of partisan politics can obscure the kind of more institutional political culture, for lack of a better term, the more structural factors that have shaped the process in the state's history, the arc of that history is pretty clear.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Well,
look, at a time when we're arguing about how we present the very fundamental facts of history, I realize people,
yeah.
But the truth of the matter, it's kind of hard to look at the empirical record in the long term of the state's history, going back from independence, Civil War, Reconstruction, from the very beginning of at least, that part of Texas history. It's a pretty clear pattern in terms of how elections are organized and the fact that they have been used as tools for exclusion, targeting, et cetera.
Yeah, I think the easiest and quickest summary statement of this that I always kind of return to is I think, the state of Texas has been found to discriminate in its election rules or in its districting against racial and ethnic minorities in every decade since the passage of the Voting Rights Act.
Right.
So, that's sort of the quick summary version. You can go into the specifics of the whys and the hows and all that piece. But but as you said, the arc of the history is pretty plainly and clearly laid out.
And I think there has been an effort in, the 21st century and the sort of what we would think of as, the modern stage of that or the contemporary stage of that history to elide that a little bit or to somehow, interestingly enough, because of the nature of Texas history, to say, well, yeah, and the Democrats did that.
Right.
Now, yes, period, full stop, but, a very different party system than we're looking at now. An obvious point for our listeners, but one that one has to flag. But if we look more recently, starting with kind of the voter ID fights of the 2000s, this has been a fairly, I don't want to say continuous, but it's been a fairly steady presence anyway in politics for all of the modern, the contemporary period. There's the contemporary period of Texas electoral history. And what I mean by that is, you say, there's not really been very many periods when Texas has not been in court.
Yeah.
For one reason or another over its voting rules.
Right. If you think about...
sometimes it's been redistricting.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, if I was trying to think, over the modern period about when there was any sort of kind of steady state, and you say, maybe after the Democratic efforts to thwart the redistricting round after 2000, and then once sort of... And if you look at the electoral results at that point, that was a point which Republicans really entered into their dominant period, and ultimately, in that sort of mid part of the 2000s especially with George W. Bush as president, there didn't seem to be as much discussion of this. And then you got to the end of that cycle and you got into a more competitive environment and you started to see this more discussion about voter ID, go further and we see, increasingly competitive environment. And with that, there hasn't really been a stop in the discussion about, at the very least, tinkering with voting rules.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd probably have to go back and look at this and, people that know this history better than I have or know the legal part of this better than I, will be quick to see how, this is too overly general. But it seems like, there was kind of a preoccupation with the voter ID litigation after, that was passed and with the redistricting thing after 2003, as you say. And there was maybe a slight lull as that was getting hammered out. But then we saw it really kind of come back in full force, interestingly enough, in 2019. Right. And as I'm looking at this, I'm realizing that the voting stuff is an interesting footnote on the common narrative that we use in here all the time and that I certainly use in talking to people about this. It's an interesting footnote to that 2019 session that we think of as being more moderated in response to the 2018 election. Well,
it's funny, as you say that, I think about the fact that, the voter ID push, so the voter ID pushes, they have a longish history, but it really picked up in the United States broadly kind of in the early and mid 2000s.
Right.
Texas was relatively early in this, but not the earliest when it came to passing voter ID law. But when you think about when did Texas, look into voter ID, and when did a lot of states look into voter ID, it was after sort of the Obama elections where there was, and I don't, it's like there's a lot of discussion about the ascendant coalition, this big change in the electorate, and then
the pushback against that.
And then the pushback against that. And then to your point, and then you have another election in 2018 where, a lot of Republicans kind of felt the brushback, even if they won. Right. And then that was the moderate session, but it was also the session in which we saw, again, a large passage.
Ending straight ticket voting. Now, we've talked about that a little bit in here, that, there's a sense in which, some people, there were people that argued against that on the Republican side from the beginning, and there's a little bit of buyer's remorse on that, I suspect.
Yeah.
I think it's mixed, and one can, Democrats were benefiting more than Republicans from straight ticket. There was more Democratic straight ticket voting than Republican straight ticket voting in sheer numbers.
Yeah.
But the Republican numbers were not trivial.
Right. I mean, again, I think, there's probably talk to someone down ballot and see what they think about that of either party.
And then, that was also where we saw the restrictions on mobile voting, right? And we had seen in response to some degree to the anticipated increase in turnout. I know, you want to talk a little, you often remind people, and I think is right, about Houston being ground zero of this. That had a lot to do with, accommodations that were made in Houston in 2018 and some other places in Texas. But Houston was kind of the target of the restrictions on mobile voting here.
Yeah, and I mean, that's the general point is here. There's been a pretty, you can focus on everything. When you say mobile voting, just to be clear, to our listeners here, we're not necessarily talking about, sort of what happened in SB1 in the 2021 session and bans
on 2019.
I know. On drive-through voting, we're not talking about the voter being mobile, but the idea was that you could set up a polling place temporarily, let's say on a college campus for 3 days of early voting. Then you could move it, to the senior center or whatever. And the idea is no, you can't do that. But the broader point,
mobile home, not.
Yes. But the broader point here is that, the state has been engaged for the last few cycles in really regulating and prescribing where and how many voting locations can take place or can exist in counties who actually run the elections throughout the state. And this has been an ongoing area of contention and how they can collect ballots.
And we did see some things in that session, there were efforts, not all of which they succeeded unevenly compared to the straight ticket voting, the restrictions on mobile voting, efforts to, that seem like they criminalized what could be seen as routine mistakes by voters, and to punish people that just had increased the punishments for people that seemed to make what had been previously thought of as just a mistake.
Right, which is important to know. We'll get into some of the underlying attitudes here, but that's something that's never been popular. I mean, we've asked about this idea of, what kind of punishments people should face for making errors, in terms of on their ballots or, trying to cast provisional ballots. And for the most part, most people do not think this should be a jailable offense. They don't think it's like a felony. They, like most of them say, okay, we caught him. It's probably a ticket and a fine or something like that. So
yeah, there was not a lot of public support for jailing people that seemed to make mistakes when they were voting.
Well, right. And yeah, well, exactly, because in almost every case, they're verified mistakes.
Right.
So,
and something else that we saw really kind of ramp up after 2020, but that had its roots prior to that, increased requirements for voter registrars and kind of making people sort of jump through more hoops to be a registrar, to sort of be a what we would call a poll worker, not a poll watcher. And we'll have to reiterate that. But then this really ramps up after the 2020 election, the discussion of election denial, the dispute over the 2020 election in the mind of the president. But also, I think, equally important, the experience in 2020, again, going back to some of the major urban areas in Texas, in efforts to accommodate voters at the height of the pandemic.
Right. So, I mean, a lot of counties in Texas, especially large urban counties, because they have, to some extent, a bigger task on their hand, passed a lot, basically made a lot of accommodations that would make it easier for people to safely cast ballots. Now, a couple problems here, right? Number one, if half or more of the electorate, as we know in Texas, didn't really believe that COVID was a problem at that point, the rationale for making it easier to vote became kind of problematic. And two, the fact that it was, largely the urban counties that support Democratic candidates that were doing this made this an obvious political target.
Yeah, and look, we can be adults here and say that, if you are a Democratic official in a city and, there is a good policy, straight ethical reason to do this in the midst of the pandemic, but you're also going to be more willing to do it because you are going to see this to your advantage.
Well, and I think we've been pretty consistent, throughout everything we've ever said to point out that, election rules are not handed down from on high. They are not they don't come from some normative principles. They are rules developed by the people who are trying to win the elections to determine.
And the normative principles are there to help you, sell these ideas.
Right, exactly.
Not to say there's no normative principles out there, and so, SB 1 did a bunch of things, banning drive-through voting, new regulations on early voting hours, including a ban on 24-hour voting, ban on the distribution of, significant limitations on the distribution of mail-in ballot applications, new ID requirements and verification procedures for voting by mail, which we'll come back to, also a correction process for mail-in voting.
Right.
And then I think things that are really going to be out there, one of the things that's really going to be out there, enhancing poll watcher protections.
Right.
So that, and by poll watchers, as I flagged earlier, we mean, non-official, not people that are helping to operate the election, but people that are there
designated
from outside entities that are designated to watch from the outside and conduct, a kind of oversight, if you will.
On behalf of the parties.
On behalf of the parties, the way that legislation was done. Yeah, it finally came out. Establishing monthly citizenship checks, which is an interesting piece. And then also, I think really something that we're watching, I think, I think is going to be important as we start seeing the elections actually happen. New rules for voter assistance, which were essentially limitations on the kind of guidance response that can come from poll workers at voting sites.
It's some of that, but that's part of it. But also, I mean, it depends. This could mean a couple different things. The other thing it has to do with is, for example.
And also, third parties helping people vote.
Vote. So, if you're bringing your grandfather to vote or something, or if someone, doesn't speak the language and needs help translating a ballot and they don't have that ballot language and sort of what that person can do.
Right. And handing out
assistance.
Handing out water, things like that.
Yeah, things like that.
So that piece of the voter assistance. Yeah, there's the poll worker voter assistance and feedback piece, and then there's the more general, how much can people get help in voting?
Right, exactly.
Right? So, what to make of this? I mean, where do you want to start? I mean, I think as we get into public opinion on this, I mean, we've sort of summarized this arc or been talking about this arc from a kind of institutional, more or less elite perspective in terms of what the legislature is doing. But this is part of a dynamic we talk about all the time here in terms of elite signaling public opinion response and the kind of reinforcing cycle that we see here. So we have tons of public opinion data on this because we've been checking on it.
Right. I mean, it's almost like which of the results should we look at? So.
Right. And this is part of the, and this is part of the grounding for the argument other than us, it being part of the brand to go to talk about the polling. But it is also one of the reasons we expect that it's going to come up.
Right. Because ultimately, we've been asking a series of questions, not only just about the specific legislation that we've been talking about here, but also about kind of the underlying attitudes that really inform people's reactions to that legislation. Because ultimately, we don't expect people to have, really deep thought out attitudes about specific policies around voting in elections, but we do know that they have general attitudes about the conduct of those elections.
Right.
And we also know that, the attitudes of Democrats and Republicans in this space in Texas differ dramatically.
Right.
And so, for example, if we look at, Republican voters first, what we find is that when we ask, how often do you think that ineligible voters basically cast a ballot in Texas elections, nearly a third of Texas Republican voters, 31%, say this happens frequently. Another 35% say it happens sometimes. So you have 66% of Texas Republicans saying that ineligible voters are casting ballots at least sometimes, if not frequently, in elections. Only 3% say this never happens. Only 16% say this happens rarely. So on balance, most Republicans think that, this is a relatively widespread occurrence.
Right.
Additionally, now, again, talking about penalties and things like that, we've asked, well, how often do you think that voters knowingly break election laws? Because we said, there's sort of this sort of criminalization or attempts, more so attempts than actual following through to criminalize routine mistakes. And so this assumes that people are actually going out trying to game the system, at least, as per the underlying, I think, logic here. And again, what we find is, while 57% of Democrats say this rarely happens, another 13% say this never happens, 1 in 5 Republican voters, 20%, say this happens frequently. So 1 in 5 Republican voters say that frequently voters are knowingly breaking election laws. Another 44% say this happens sometimes.
And this is where we add there's virtually no evidence that this is the case.
Thank you. Moving on. So then, the next question becomes, okay, so we're getting all this policy in response. Well, we ask this question kind of regularly as a heat check, right? So, should the rules for voting in Texas be more or less strict than they are now? Looking at February 2022, so pretty recent data, the plurality of Republicans, now this is, again, I should be clear, we asked this in February 22, so all the policy we've been talking has already happened.
That is, I should be more specific. In other words, this is after the 2021, well after the 2021 legislative session when SB 1 was passed and all this new sort of set of rules and restrictions that we had talked about had gone into place.
And on the heels of all the 2019 legislation and on the heels of almost a near decade of voter ID basically litigation. And still, a plurality of Republicans, 48%, say the law should be more strict. The other 39% say it should be left as they are now. Only 7% say less strict, as opposed to 58% of Democrats. So ultimately, there's still an appetite for these laws. But also the other effect of this sort of, constant attack on the system, but also, on the one hand, in terms of, the accuracy of election results and things like that, the presence of fraud, even though there's no evidence of fraud, is the fact that you also have, Democratic attitudes towards the system, hemorrhaging in a pretty negative way as well, right?
Right.
So what we ask, for example, well, how often do you think eligible voters are prevented from voting? Now, not surprisingly, 51% of Republicans here say never. If you're an eligible voter, you are never prevented from voting. For Democrats, we see, again, a similar pattern to what we saw with Republicans. A little more than a third, 36% say this happens frequently. We ask about whether or not the Texas election system discriminates against racial or ethnic minorities. 87% of Republicans say no. 79% of Democrats say yes. And so what you have is and
that, that's kind of like, in some ways, when I see that response, on one hand, it's unnuanced. On the other hand, it's one of those heat check questions where when you ask somebody a kind of overarching question like that without a lot of, there's no place to hide from that.
Well, the thing about, and I'll just say, I think someone might want to know.
That's why we ask that as a yes, no, just to get that basic.
Yeah, and I think one thing I should add just for the sake of this, and it's one of these things about this argument that is, it's one of those things that it makes it more complicated, but it's definitely a part of it, which is this question about race and ethnicity and the role that plays in all of this. But when we ask that same question about discrimination in the election system, we look among racial and ethnic subgroups, we find the majority of white people, white voters, 63% say no, it does not. Only 29% say it does. Among African Americans, 76% say that the system discriminates against racial and ethnic minorities. Only 12% say it doesn't. And among Hispanics, it's nearly split. 42% say it does, 41% say it doesn't.
Right.
And so this is a
broaches a lot of interesting questions in the discussion we're having right now. Another discussion we're having right now about Latino attitudes, partisanship, views of the system.
So when you consider these underlying attitudes towards the system, and again, there are many others that we could sample from that would also help kind of illustrate why this remains, if not front and center, certainly on one of the burners. Right.
There for the activating
it's certainly,
under the right circumstances.
It's certainly there for the activating, but it does kind of, again, raise this question of why it might not be talked about more and why we might expect it to be talked about more as we get closer to the election, right?
Yeah, I mean, the why it doesn't get talked about more. God, that whole space has gotten
It's kind of complicated.
very complicated. I mean, we're talking about the broader level, even it being a crowded issue agenda, but it's also, there's a lot of dimensions to this, and I do think that both parties have settled into waiting for triggers to some degree.
Yeah,
Republicans probably there are different timing issues. There's a rhythm to this, but I mean, to go back to where we started, I find it hard to imagine that we're not going to start hearing about this soon. I mean, mail-in ballots are a good example.
Right. Mail-in ballots are a great example. We saw during the primary a surge in the rejection rate of mail-in ballots from about, 2% in the 2018 election to over 12% in the 2022 primaries. And we're just looking at midterms, I think was the reason for that comparison. Now, ultimately, this was not, I don't want to say this was not a huge deal. It was less problematic in Texas's low turnout primaries.
Right.
However,
but there were election officials were flying, were definitely trying to raise the flag at that point, and I think they just didn't get a lot of response.
Well, I think they did get a response actually. So they raised the flag about this. They said, "Hey, look, if you," and I think I have a tweet somewhere that says, "Hey, multiply this out to your average Texas election cycle and the number of mail-in ballots you've got, and you're rejecting hundreds of thousands of ballots." Now, the response from, I think, state leaders has been, well, look, this was really only a problem in a few counties.
Right.
Now, which counties were those?
A few large ones.
A few large counties. Now, it's like, well, yes, number one, we'd expect the problems to be larger in large counties because there are more people and therefore more votes. But also, these are the counties, in particular Harris County, that the voting law, the SB1 was made in some ways to combat the efforts of.
Right.
And so the fact that these problems are now occurring in sort of, again, the larger and in many cases, Democratic leaning counties, even though, the rejection rates across parties were pretty comparable. It wasn't as though this was like a Democrat problem or Republican problem per se. But the idea that this would not be something that's concerning to Republicans and Republican state leaders and let's say state level election administrators going into the general election is sort of not surprising from just a raw politics standpoint.
Right, and to fill in a couple of gaps there, I mean, just to, connect the dots, I mean, one of the changes in the voting laws was, which was much disputed during the discussion on the floor of the law, was that, the increased requirements for validating mail-in ballots and for authenticating your vote were likely to lead to this.
Yeah, I mean, everybody knew this would be a problem because it was just more complicated. And I mean, and that is what, and look, and I'm saying that with no judgment at all. It just definitionally was more complicated.
Well, I would say this: it's a judgment. It's a fair empirical judgment, not a moral judgment or a political judgment.
Well, I'm choosing not to make either of those. Right. I'm just saying it just from on its face, you're asking voters to do more, right?
Yeah,
you're asking them to do more in a very specific way, and
you're increasing more opportunity for error.
Yeah, and that's it, and that just is what it is.
Yeah.
Okay.
I would still say that's a judgment. It's just it's a fair one. And so I think so. So that is going on there, and that is definitely going to be. I'd be shocked if that's not an issue.
And we saw it in the primaries. We're going to know about it before we get to the election. I mean, to your point about the rhythms of these things, we'll start seeing rejection rate information. If Travis County or Harris County starts rejecting 5, 6, 10, 12% of its mail-in ballots in the first, let's say, couple weeks of early voting, when they just start to review these things. Well, we're going to hear about it,
right? Because there are notification requirements for the rejection.
Exactly.
Right. So which I think the authors of the bill would say, see, there's a mechanism for people to fix this.
As long as you get your mail-in ballot in early enough, check it early enough, and then get it fixed early enough. Yes.
Right. And so, so we're going to see that. We know that. But I guess the other open question then is, to what degree do we see a resumption of the kind of freelance, non-official activities that we saw in 2020. Mm-hmm. One piece of this, that is now not quite so much freelancing now, but, will the law encourage more, quote unquote, election observers to be present in places where voting is going on and to be interventionist? And how much will we hear about that? What will that look like? What will the responses be? And then, of course, in 2020, we also saw some of the more frankly, kind of wild incidents like the Steve Hotze employed guy who, drove, was following a white van around that he was convinced, had stolen ballots in it, turned out to not be the case, and legal difficulties ensued for the people involved there. But I mean, there was a lot of encouragement of that kind of activity and out there freelancing in 2020. And I don't see a lot of reason to not think that's going to happen again.
Yeah, I mean, I would surely expect it to have that happen after the election, and you already alluded to this in the point, and you alluded to earlier, but I think the thing that we're going to see in this election cycle, or what, I expect to be, a story we're going to be hearing soon is how do partisan poll watchers, behave. I mean, and this is within a context in which, there have been constant attacks on election administrators, volunteer, poll workers, the people trying to actually run the election,
right.
for these counties. And, the SB1 has given these partisan poll watchers greater protections. It's put greater penalties and obstacles in the way of, poll workers and election administrators. And the question is, take those two things, add in sort of inflammatory rhetoric about, the desires of these, administrators, and it is going to be
motivations.
It is,
right?
yeah, their motivation.
Questioning everybody's motivations.
And so what happens? I mean, I think there's this sort of. I mean, I think I'm really interested both in terms of the way that partisan poll watchers behave vis-a-vis their interactions with poll workers, but I think there's another thing about this, which is how do they behave with respect to their interactions with voters, of which they should have very few, if any, interactions.
Right.
And I'm wondering, how much, again, and part of this is there may not be necessarily a lot of cases of sort of specific, misconduct, but how much intimidation is going on.
Right.
And that's something I think is, we're going to be hearing about this election
right.
cycle.
Because, and part of this is that, the rewriting of the law was in part, I wouldn't even say motivated, but it's going to have the effect of creating more space for poll watchers to have a presence that they can then say, look, we're not being intimidated. We're not being intimidating. We're just doing what the law allows us to do.
Yeah.
And that's going to be the discourse that's going to come out of that.
Right.
Right. And so, I expect, I do think that's going to be very interesting. And if I was to give, somebody was to call and ask me about this, I mean, I think what's going to be interesting about that is where those incidents take place. There inevitably are going to be some. Mm-hmm. And I'm not saying that all will turn out to be intimidation, but look, the boundaries have changed.
Yeah.
And so those boundaries are going to be are now going to be open to contestation from both sides.
Yeah, the legal boundaries have changed, and the rhetorical boundary has moved
the
dramatically.
normative, and it reflects these kind of change in the normative boundaries, right?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I was thinking about during this whole debate about the partisan poll watchers is it seems to me that, one thing that could have been done to help this a little bit would be to say, the partisan poll watcher has to reside either, in the county or the precinct in which they're watching the poll.
Yeah.
At the very least, so you're not sort of, seeming like you're bringing people in from outside the community to police the community, whatever that means. But obviously that's not what's going to be happening in a lot of places.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. I wonder if there was an amendment on that. Probably not, because
I don't think
it was
so.
Probably acceding too much to the premise from the people that would put an amendment for it. But I don't remember. I watched a lot of that debate, but it was long.
Yeah.
So I think to sum up, I mean, this calm before the storm edition of second reading.
That could be any reading.
Yeah, the day after Election Day, we can say, and by the way, we can do like one of those pundit check things and go, well, nothing happened. I don't think that's going to be the case.
Think so.
We wouldn't have done this, but I think where I would want to leave it a little bit is, as I kind of flagged very briefly earlier, in thinking kind of analytically and in the big picture about this. What we are talking about here is this ongoing shift in the discourse around elections, around democracy that was, has been part of a development that's been going on for a couple of decades now.
Yeah.
And, I think it's one thing for us, when we have our academic hats on to go, just continue to intone, look, elections are political, election rules are points of dispute.
Yeah.
The rules, these changes are not neutral or they're never neutral, et cetera, et cetera. It is a related but different thing to say, we are now entering a period that I think is a little unlike what we've seen before.
Yeah.
In that, in the rule, we just kind of stumbled on it in a way. I mean, the shift in the legal boundaries is also reflecting a real shift in something that we've talked about here a bit, and that is democratic norms. The degree to which people, have commonly shared assumptions about where the boundaries are around elections.
Yeah. And
having people inside ballot, voting locations on the edge of intervention with particular voters and with the officials conducting the elections, because there is such a deep suspicion about the process, is a different spot.
Well, I almost say there's such a wellspring of deep suspicion about the process in the public that's been fanned repeatedly, but now, in some ways, I think, again, we're stumbling into something, whereas if you think about that arc that we were talking about, the previous sort of movements were either sort of very, sort of traditional attempts to kind of, distribute power and redistricting and things like that. And then even when you kind of move on to the voter ID era and pieces like that, I mean, I was saying this even going into 2019, I'll say this, there's a very fair argument that the architects of the state's election laws could make about uniformity.
Sure.
They could say, look, setting aside the fact that Texas is a very diverse place geographically, population density-wise, in terms of education levels, all these things, we think that each county should run the election essentially the same way. And I think a lot of the laws could kind of fall into that bucket, right? And the idea that we just want to make sure that all the rules are the same. One could say that. But we're moving into...
several did, including Senator Hughes.
And,
early and often.
Tried. And ultimately, each of those efforts, in many ways reflected these underlying attitudes we're talking about, because, they move the, again, sort of in a way, they move the election system towards, something I think is more towards what, I think Republicans would like. But as we move to this next phase of this, what you're seeing is less, I think, of a discussion about like making these little tweaks to the system and, sort of things that would lead towards uniformity, whether uniformity leads to equal, fair outcomes or not.
Right.
Set that aside, to one in which we're talking more about like, is this going to affect the vote? And you see that with partisan poll watchers. That's kind of the question we're asking here. Are these people going to affect the way that, other citizens engage with the process? And then further, it connects to this broader discussion that we've talked about before about this idea of like democracy versus republic. I mean, if you're thinking about, we're going to have people at the polling place sort of watching over you. And then the other goes, well, maybe voters shouldn't choose senators.
Right. And
maybe the legislature should.
Maybe under some circumstances, the Secretary of State should be empowered to weigh in more heavily as
maybe the Attorney General should be
a little bit more of a, it's almost, more of a coach than an umpire.
Well, I was saying maybe not even the Secretary of State, but I mean, one of the big things I think is going to come up, it's probably going to come up in the session is, is the legislature going to give the Attorney General the power to enforce election laws anywhere in the state or not?
Right, since the Supreme Court even in Texas
Twice.
Seems to be now is resistant to that.
Has been resistant to that even against political pressure. And so, but that's, again, it's another one of these things where it's like, we're not even talking necessarily about, adjusting sort of like, well, how, what ID do you have to show, or when can you show up and vote early, or what kind of information needs to go to the ballot, to how much, where can we put ourselves more into the process of voting? You see that at the Attorney General level. You see that at these broad discussions about representation in federal elections. And I think, you're seeing it now even in terms of, the rights that candidates and their, designated individuals have vis-a-vis the actual people who are supposed to administer the election.
Well, and I think, and again, in the broadest possible sense, I go back to, one of my favorite borrowed figures of speech or comparisons, which is, there's a certain amount of Munchausen syndrome going on here in the sense of the cultivation of a problem over a long period of time.
Yeah.
These incremental kind of actions that we've talked about that have a kind of, you're going to laugh about this, but, there's a certain productive internal contradiction all along to this, which is, on one hand, we're going to like really fundamentally try to make interventions even though they're incremental, things like voter ID, all the little things we've talked about. But against a backdrop in which to accomplish these, we are eroding overall trust in the system on both sides.
Yeah.
Right. And so by the time you get now to 2019, 2021, see what's going to happen in 2023, you've now exacerbated a problem that was not nearly as bad from a kind of, democratic norms, systemic trust level as it was when you started. But now that you've exacerbated, you now have the rationale to address the problem, but to address the problem in a way that, as you're kind of getting at, fundamentally changes the nature of the system, or at least crosses the norms that we had seen before.
Well, it certainly has to, because as we pointed out, there's no evidence that the problem actually exists.
And so, and then and what I worry about when we talk about, the sort of mundane fact of the political nature of these disputes is that, we've gone from the political nature of disputes that have to do with tweaking to, the political nature of one that is fundamentally about changing some structural characteristics here. So with that, watch for it.
There we go.
I say that because I think it's worth watching. And another thing that happens, because of this trajectory is that we get used to these disputes as kind of, the normal sort of, one of the normal things we're going to see at elections. I mean, we talked about, and this is a good back end plug. We talked about, the piece you just put up on the blog site that people ought to go look at about, what is a likely voter, right? And the likely voter screens. It becomes almost a regular thing. It's like, well, it's an election. People are going to be arguing about this. There's going to be some irregularities. For your average voter, I think it becomes a little bit noisy.
Yeah.
Or to the extent that you notice, it then falls into the kind of partisan templates that we're talking about here. But it is yet another thing in which it feels like we're in a little bit of a watershed on this, and it bears watching, to my mind. So,
yeah, and the only thing I'll add to that, I agree, and I think the reason that I agree is because I think we've talked about this, but I mean, all the polling indicates that it's pretty likely that Republicans are going to maintain their dominance of statewide elections. If not, because of the failings of Democrats or the party system, because it's a Republican year in a lot of ways, right? I mean, just in general, there's a lot of reasons to think that. Having said that, if O'Rourke loses to Abbott by 5 or 6 or 7 points. Again, that's a pretty big improvement for Democrats, cycle over cycle in terms of their competition at the statewide level. That'll take place in, increasingly restrictive voting regimes, and what I would expect to be ever more restrictive voting regimes in the next cycles if we continue to see the state becoming more and more competitive. Right.
I mean, I think the fallout of this is that, even if, and I'm not saying this is going to happen, but even if, just to, since we're, in a world of non-zero probabilities, even if the Democrats were to win a statewide race, I think it only accelerates that incentive for Republicans to continue. There will be a Republican majority in the legislature, and it will only continue that the incentives that they have to continue to make these kinds of changes.
Well, and if anything, it would inflame it, because it would give them the one thing that they don't have, which is to say, yes, voter fraud is rampant. We just happen to win all the elections.
Except for this one.
But that's the thing, though. But if they were to lose it, they could actually say, aha.
Right.
We've had it. And the thing is, and in the last election cycle, I mean, Dan Patrick went so far as to say, is the only way that Democrats are going to win Texas is if there's massive voter fraud.
Right.
And so the predicate's already being laid, again, in a system that is, by any definition, becoming significantly more competitive, to say, well, yeah, but if it actually shows the manifestation of that competition, that can only be due to fraud.
Right. And we should add that, the lieutenant governor borrowed that line from the president, who said that in 2016 as well.
Sure.
But again,
fellow travelers, though. I mean,
yes, and the lieutenant governor was arguably there first in a lot of other ways. But so with that, thanks to Josh for being here. Thanks to our excellent production team in the audio studio and the Liberal Arts Development Studio at UT Austin. Remember, you can find all the data we've referenced today, much, much more at the Texas Politics Project website. That's texaspolitics.utexas.edu. Thank you for listening, and we'll be back soon with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.